Um, I want to talk a bit about the anniversary of a very important event. That is 26 years since the Tiananmen Square massacre in predominantly Beijing, but also actually in China generally that year. People think it was restricted to Beijing, but actually there was reports of unrest elsewhere. Um, I could potentially make the same video every year, and there's a chance that I'll say something every year about it. But every year there's a slightly different angle on it in that, well, not really. I'm saying that there isn't really a different angle on it, but I've seen the development, and this is interesting. This is a link on CNN, but basically it says this is a letter that was penned by Chinese overseas students and it's under a banner of China Change, news and commentary from those who work for change. On the 26th anniversary of Tiananmen massacre, an open letter to fellow students in mainland China. Now, I'm not going to read it out simply because it is quite lengthy, but basically, this is something I think is quite refreshing because it's a group of overseas students who, instead of sort of closing up or making excuses for the CCP, are openly calling for discussion about this event in mainland China. Written by, I don't think I'm putting them in danger by reading the names because it is an open letter and this is YouTube. So, Gu Ye of the University of Georgia, co-signed by Feng Yuan of the University of Central Lancashire, that's in the UK, Cheng Guangchuan of Columbia University, Cheng Dan of Adelphi University, Chen Bing-shu of Missouri State University, Jin Meng of Northwest Missouri State University, Lu Yan of the University at Albany, SUMY, Wang Xiaoyu of the University at Albany, SUMY, Wang Jianying of the University of Missouri, Meng Li of St John's University, and Wu Li-bao, Melbourne, Australia. Doesn't say specifically which institution. Clearly, these are overseas Chinese students, predominantly American universities, but there's one British university there, one Australian university. So clearly, this is an initiative that has taken some pace. Um, I think Tiananmen is a very important issue. Not because it is the worst event in Chinese history, far from it. There's been many examples of far, far deadlier events in the long history of China. In fact, in the history of China, this is quite small scale compared to some of the bloodshed that has been spilt in various government massacres over the years. Certainly, it is small scale compared to what happened during the Cultural Revolution. However, the reason it is important is partly because it is the most recent large scale massacre that we know about. That is, there has been reports of massacres in Xinjiang in recent years that have been unconfirmed. So I'm going to speak about this in some detail because I think it is an important issue. Firstly, I specifically want to address Chinese people who may be watching this. You may be thinking this is an anti-China video. Well, I would simply ask you to understand the difference between a government and a country. I'm not anti-China at all. Um, and I'm not even against every single thing the Chinese government does. There's some things I support them on. For example, the recent smoking ban. I think that's probably a productive move in a country where that is a serious health problem. So I don't absolutely disagree with everything the Communist Party does. However, I do think their censorship of truth is reprehensible, utterly reprehensible. Um, and I don't know how anyone can support that. I'm talking about the suppression of truth here. The thing is, I've been in a number of debates with overseas students about this, and I know they're overseas students because it's the only way they can access YouTube unless they have a VPN. And either that, or they've just told me, or In my own circle of friends, I've got a lot of Chinese friends, and admittedly, this is not something I've spoken to all of them about. Nor would I necessarily bring it up out of the blue. It's not necessarily a cheery subject. Um, so I still don't entirely know what all my friends would. I did have an awkward debate with someone close to me, and she insisted that the protesters were stupid. I got a little bit irritated by that, and we had a bit of a. I mean, this is someone who I've known for quite a while, and she's a decent person, but I couldn't really fathom why she was taking that position, and we had a bit of a debate about it. Um, I find there's an interesting reaction from a lot of Chinese. Either, well, one thing that is interesting is, despite the censorship, there is actually probably most Chinese of a certain age are familiar with this event on some level. I know that many young Chinese people have seen footage of the event in some way or another. Um, it's been leaked through, it's got through the Great Firewall, and there is low-level debate in China. One thing about China, it's not quite accurate to say there's absolutely no debate. There is, but the point is, it's absolutely not, doesn't have the sort of free scope that you would have in more relaxed liberal countries. I think that's just a fair, obvious statement. Now, what these students are calling for, and they say that they were all born in the 80s and 90s, so these are young students. We're not talking here about academics now in their 40s and 50s who were around at that time. This is why this is an interesting letter. These are people who were children or not even born when this event happened. Now, to me, that's refreshing because it shows that there is a generation who, sometimes it looks like the Communist Party's strategy is working and they are successfully allowing this event to be forgotten. But this open letter shows that there are young people who are concerned about this. The thing about Chinese overseas students is I don't think you can ever really generalize them as being one way or the other. There has been examples where they have been pretty nationalistic and have been acted as apologists for the CCP, but as this shows, there is another contingent who want to speak out and who want to know the truth. Now, when I mention those who act as apologists, I don't know if that's a genuine belief, or I don't know if it's because they're afraid, or I don't know if they're just acting in a nationalistic way because they don't like Westerners talking about this. And I know that is a big issue in China. Very often, when Westerners speak about these things, there is the same old nauseating response: "Oh, it's biased Western media," this sort of thing, and that irritates me because it's just, if this is all biased Western media, then what you are getting at by insinuation is that the whole thing was staged, and all those scenes of angry, bloody people running around the streets of Beijing were all actors. I mean, this has to be the height of conspiracy theory craziness, in my opinion. And I think people who insist on saying it's all Western media bias are guilty of not being objective because, and I'm not saying that to offend anyone, but it's just my opinion. I think if you always say whenever a Westerner raises this issue, or whenever anyone raises this issue, that it is Western media bias, I have a question for you. If the Communist Party is innocent, why are they hiding the event? Don't you think if they were innocent or if they were justified in what they've done, then they would have no problem with putting out their case to the public and saying, yes, yes, this happened, but this is why we had to do it, or whatever. But the fact that they're hiding it shows I don't think they're guilty. I don't think the Communist Party has any guilt, but I think they are worried about the truth emerging because they feel it will trigger another spate of unrest. Now, since that time, there has been, despite the Communist Party's allusion to a harmonious society, there has been outbreaks of serious unrest. Um, Not necessarily about exactly the same issues, but some similar issues. during the beginning of the Arabian Spring, there was a similar off-reaction in China. As we know, Arabian Spring ended up in a very difficult situation, but there was calls at that time for a so-called Jasmine Revolution in China. It never materialized because the thing about China, it's a huge country, and it's also the fact that there has been more and more people going into the middle class more means that materialistically speaking, people are in a better position than they were, say, a generation ago. So to that extent, the Communist Party has managed to keep enough people happy in order for this not to re-emerge. But if certain issues are not dealt with, for example, the tensions between migrant workers um, and the middle class in cities, and some of the Chinese Communist Party's land building programs, this sort of thing, these are the sort of things that will bubble up and could eventually lead to serious unrest. And actually, there has been bouts of serious unrest, especially over issues to do with building. I don't know all the details, but that tends to be, from what I can see, one of the main points of contention. There's a few things about Tiananmen Square that are a bit of a misconception, and I admit for a long time that I'd been misguided about this as well. Number one is we always associate with students, and although that's an iconic image because students are always very radical and very passionate, actually many of those involved in the unrest and the protests were ordinary civilians, and they weren't necessarily calling for Western style democracy. They were just generally unhappy with the state of things. I'm not going to give a long-winded history lesson here because a lot of the events are already well documented. For example, the death of the leader, I believe his name was Hu Guafang, um, or Hu Yao Pang, I should say. Um, but basically, it wasn't quite a case that these were all students agitating for Western style democracy. There was a lot of different grievances, and there was a lot of different people involved. In fact, from what I've seen, most of the dead weren't actually students, but ordinary civilians. I've also seen reports or I've seen opinions that among the dead were soldiers as well. Now, it remains to be seen what exactly happened, whether that was soldiers killing other PLA soldiers, whether some civilians had got their hands on weapons, we don't know. But the point about this is if that was the case, if this was a violent insurrection, and the Communist Party will justify it saying, oh, these were terrorists that we had to put down or whatever, which I believe is an utter lie. But even if that was the case, don't you think they would defend themselves? Wouldn't that make sense? If they're innocent, wouldn't they defend themselves and say we had to use force? I mean, if we look at similar crackdowns since that time, governments have rarely tried to cover it up in the same way. I mean, if we look at the situation in Egypt, one of the largest scale massacres since Tiananmen Square was the massacre of Muslim Brotherhood supporters in Tahrir Square in 2013. At least 600 were killed. And the figures of Tiananmen Square are anywhere from a low of 400 to a high of 3 to 4,000. We'll never know the exact figure, but certainly a lot of people were killed and injured. Um, Now, in the case of Egypt, again, the Egyptian government used excuses as an alibi for that, like these were dangerous Islamists and so on. No doubt the CCP will have excuses, but I find it curious that they don't even allow discussion on this. Now, I personally think that is utterly reprehensible. I think it's cowardly on their part because they don't want people to know the truth. And it makes me wonder, are they so scared that if people find out the truth, it will trigger more protests? There's a group called Tiananmen Mothers, and if the Communist Party's position is through fear of vengeance or something like that, I would ask, well, what fear do they have from the Tiananmen Mothers? This is a group who is primarily consisting of mothers who lost their sons and daughters in the unrest, and all they want is justice. Li Peng, who was, as far as I know, the head of the PLA at the time, he's an old man now. I believe he's around 90, but he's still alive. In a fair world, in a fair system, then he would be treated, as far as I'm concerned, the same way that former Khmer Rouge leaders are on trial in Cambodia. He would be on trial for crimes against humanity, uh, for very least for covering this event up, and then that's something the Communist Party is collectively guilty of. Of all the problems I have with the CCP, I think this is the one that really bugs me most of all. Their fundamental dishonesty and their fundamental shameful lack of transparency. I just think it is interesting that whenever there is something like the situation with the Olympic torch, the Communist Party openly encourages nationalism, and they have no problem with overseas Chinese students angrily protesting about the bias West and all this sort of stuff. But when it comes to discussion of their own history, then it's all covered up. Really pisses me off, actually. When I was over there, spent 6 months in China, if you don't know, I done everything I was told. I didn't disobey any laws. I certainly didn't speak to my students openly about these events. But I also took the logic that if one of my students asked me about it, I was not going to lie to them. And it's not that I know all the details, but what I would have said was, in my opinion, and from what I know, this is what happened. And in my opinion, your government has a responsibility to tell you, as a Chinese citizen, the truth. Um, some people say, oh, we should just forget it and move on. And I've heard some of the debates I've had with people, that has been the attitude they've taken. That's fine for them if they didn't personally lose relatives in it. But what about Chinese people who did lose relatives, such as the Tiananmen mothers? And as time goes on and on, it's 26 years now, time is going on, it will get further and further back, and the danger is that this generation will forget. So I'm very grateful to these students for raising the issue. Um, and if, as they say, they were born in the 80s and 90s, that's a very insignificant thing. If they're older professors or something, then it's unfortunately it doesn't carry the same weight. But if there is today's generation want to know the truth, that's a very good thing, in my opinion. You know, the thing here is I don't want to see unrest in China, okay? So I don't want people to misunderstand me. As much as I dislike the Communist Party, this is not about wanting to see unrest. I don't want to see angry protests and people smashing up government offices, this sort of thing. But I do want people to get justice, and I do think that people have a right to know the truth. I cannot think of anywhere else in the world um, where you would have an event on this scale that is covered up to the extent that there is millions of Chinese who either don't know about it or don't dare speak about it. Of course, there's other authoritarian regimes in the world, but there tends to be in those situations sort of well, I suppose it's the same here, but um, China's not the most secretive country in the world, far from it. That obviously goes to North Korea. China's a lot more open since that time, and obviously Chinese students can study abroad. And when they study abroad, they have access to this information. But in my opinion, a lot of Chinese students are biased in favor of the CCP, and they're all too willing to make excuses for the CCP. Now, I don't know that if that's because they've grown up with a communist education system where they're only hearing one point of view, or if they genuinely believe the government's version. But this is the thing. If you're saying that, oh, it's all a big lie, no civilians were killed that day, see, that still doesn't explain why there's no open discussion about it. It still doesn't explain why the Communist Party doesn't allow open discussion. I believe China still has a very long way to go with this, and I dream of a day when these sort of events can openly be discussed in China. I think it will probably be, sadly, I don't think the victims will ever get justice for their loved ones who were killed on that day. But at the very least, maybe one day the government will come clean about this. Um, and I know the other thing is people will throw back and say, oh, look at what Western governments have done. The difference is, whilst Western governments also have blood on their hands, I mean, for example, I can give an example of my country. In the United Kingdom, the British security forces were accused of many crimes in Northern Ireland, not on this scale, but still bad enough. And there were human rights abuses there. And yes, at the time the government tried to cover it up. Not today, though. And for the most part, we can openly discuss any contentious areas that the government was involved in. There's no censorship of it. If I want to talk about crimes in Northern Ireland, um, or for that matter, in Britain's imperial past, I'm not going to be censored for it. And this is what I find, this is where there is a difference. It's not about one government being better than another. That is not what I'm trying to speak about in this video. Although, believe me, if any Western government was to commit a massacre on this scale, the leaders involved will be in jail by now. Um, and this is the problem with a one-party state. When you have a one-party state, the ruling party can control everything, can control all the media in their favor, so there is absolutely no one dares ask questions. Any journalist in China brave enough to ask these questions would find themselves under house arrest or roughed up by CCP thugs in the middle of the night. This is everything I'm saying here is common sense. Now, once again, if you're Chinese and you disagree with me, I ask you to address my points. Why does the CCP cover it up? Answer that question, please. Why do they cover it up if they've got nothing to hide? If you're going to say, well, there was innocent troops killed that day as well, and some civilians had weapons, etc. Again, why cover it up? Don't you think the government would publicly explain why they done that in order to use, positive propaganda for themselves? Quite strange when you think about it, because covering it up only makes them look more suspicious. So I'm going to leave it there. I've spoken for a while, but incidentally, needless to say, Hong Kong is the only part of China where the event can openly be commemorated, and every year it is. Um, Obviously, there's a different twist to it this year because this is ongoing with the context of last year's Hong Kong protests, which began roughly around this time last year. So Hong Kong itself is facing a critical stage in its relationship with the mainland. Um, I find there's two responses from overseas Chinese. Either they know what happened or they're reluctant to talk about it, or they act as sort of apologists for the CCP. So if you're an overseas student, I'm not making this video in order to try and be provocative or offend you. I'm making it because I believe that the truth needs to be told. I don't know all the truth, but I do believe that very bad things happened that day, and I believe there's ample evidence for that. The Communist Party really has no leg to stand on. What that expression means is their arguments look very, very, very flawed. So what's their excuse? Um, anyway, I'll leave it there. Let me know your thoughts. I would actually like to hear from Chinese viewers. I I don't want you to jump on to this and think I'm anti-China. Again, being critical of the CCP is not the same as being anti-China, and I'm not critical of every single thing the CCP does. But I'm not going to lie, I'm not a big fan of some of their behaviour, and I think this censorship, it's cowardly because I believe the Chinese people have a right to know the truth. I mean, hiding it from them is treating them like children. And I find it quite strange. There's a lot of people who sort of take the attitude, oh, we should just move on. But I ask you the question, what if your family member had died in 1989? Would you want to move on and forget it? So leave it there. 26 years. Um, Time is moving on, but this event will never be forgotten.